that the churning movement of the Earth's liquid core is weakening the field of the planet in some regions of the planet areas around the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean. Scientists have also detected that every now and then our magnetic field is bombarded with cosmic rays from space. And for years they didn't know where cosmic rays came from, and now they're saying they believe that they are caused by supernovas, explosions, remnants of stars. And several months ago, a report came out that scientists are looking at new clues that our universe may be a holographic reality, a computer simulation. And specifically, they're looking at cosmic rays and their equation, which makes this even more interesting. So there's been a number of other anomalies. I'm going to try to speed this up to get to the next section. Missing matter caught in tangled cosmic webs. Magnetic fields offer black hole escape route. And this relates to the Earth itself may be a living conscious being responding to the solar flares. This is from the Daily Mail, June 1st, 2012. Last month's solar flare created a mysterious pulse on Earth that seemed to answer the sun's blast. So there's been a lot of changes in our solar system, the new discoveries that indicates that the world as we know it, the universe as we know it, is changing very, very fast. For example, water ice has been discovered on Mercury. New storm on Jupiter hints at climate change. Pluto's atmosphere larger than thought. Dark side of Uranus rings reveals dramatic changes. NASA's Cassini satellite sees abrupt turn in Titan's atmosphere. That's one of Saturn's moons. And Saturn, by the way, there's been a lot of storms that have been recorded on the surface of that planet over the course of the last decade. NASA's spacecraft reveals dramatic changes in the atmosphere of Mars. Strongest evidence yet that there is life on Mars. Bizarre vortex on Venus changes shape every day. By the way, this is from space.com. And they're also detecting changes in Venus, changes in the ionosphere of Venus. And this came out on the 20th of April of just this year. 7 new planets have been found. 2 of them may sustain life. There's obviously a lot of changes taking place within the solar system, but the focus of this presentation, and all that was the preface for what we'll get into now, is how human beings are affected by these changes. Emotional states. Pattern recognition is what we're looking at here with the connection between peaks in solar cycles, solar activities, times of solar maximum, and the launching of new battles, wars, conflicts, false flag events, specifically at certain times. And we're going to be looking at a number of individuals that have provided information about the quantitative information that everybody has access to in terms of these solar cycles. And Alexander Chavinsky is one of the most historical figures. He was an acclaimed scientist in Russia who studied the biological effects of the sun and universe. In particular, how mouse changes in human behavior correlated to sunspot cycles. In 1915, he started to look in this direction at the effects of the sun. He spent a summer observing the sun and first hypothesized the effect of periodic changes in solar activity on the organic world. In 1916, he entered the front lines of World War I, and it was there that he first discovered that battles tended to wax and wane with the strength of solar flares and geomagnetic storms. He constructed what's called the Index of Mass Human Excitability, which traced the incidence of wars, revolutions, riots, expeditions, and migrations from 500 BC to 1922 AD. And he was jailed for his research by Stalin in 1942. He asked Chavatsky to retract his writings in solar cycles, which contradicted Soviet theories of the reasons for the Russian revolutions of 1905 and 1917. So he did 8 years in a forced labor gulag, followed by 8 years of Soviet rehabilitation, where he then conducted scientific work in the coal mines. Of course, Russia did commemorate Alexander Chavinsky, but it was a little too late. But his research spawned other studies. For example, Raymond Wheeler from the University of Kansas confirmed that the pattern, in fact, does span human history as far back as 2,500 years. He found that intense magnetic upswings directly affect the human brain and at times drove mankind into deadly emotional tantrums and frenzied killing sprees. He also wrote a book entitled Climate, the Key to Understanding Business Cycles. Edward Dewey found his information and statistically analyzed it. He is the founder of the Foundation for the Study of Cycles. Dewey validated the existence of these war cycles, and he described the 4 components of Chizevsky's 11-year cycle and their appropriate links. And this kind of illustrates the 4 cycles. The blue section, the yellow, the red, and the yellow again. Dewey wrote in 1970 that knowing that wars have a cyclical nature related to sunspot cycles implies that they have a common cause, and therefore they are predictable. If so, maybe they can be avoided. But for the powers that be, and their perspective on things, events can be staged. People can be manipulated, especially if they're out of balance and out of alignment with their own truth. Dr. Robert Becker and Dr. Friedman also looked at this information and found that more people flip out at times of increased geomagnetic activity and that there was an increase in psychiatric hospital admissions. Now, Carol Moore has a website entitled Sunspots and Activist Strategy, and I'm going to read a quote that I feel is very pertinent to what we just discussed and also where we could be going. Governmental leaders often respond to mass protests by starting wars to unite the people and suppress dissent. Also, they themselves may get caught up in the mania caused by negative ionization and launch irrational wars. Activists since the 1960s, like myself, have lived through several sunspot heights. From 68 to 71, 79 to 82, 89 to 1992, and the 2000 to 2003 periods. We can look back at our own experiences of several years of frenzied activity with big meetings and big protests, when the least indignation might lead to riots, rebellions, revolutions, civil wars. And we can remember other periods of years where once vital organizations declined or died. Meetings and protests were fewer and smaller, and lethargic people seemed to be willing to endure repression. Then, just when few remaining activists were in deep despair, a magical resurgence of activity. If governmental intelligence agencies are on their toes, they have bookmarked this page, and they have experts studying the effects of sunspots on activism so they can squelch or even redirect such energies when they rise again. There are many examples of this. So it's hardly silly for activists also to look at the evidence that these cycles have influenced all of human history and to learn the implications of these cycles for activist organizing today and in the future. I've been talking to this guy over email for several years, and I feel that the work of Dr. Burl Payne needs to reach a larger audience, and I'm hoping that through this presentation, more people will look at what Dr. Burl Payne has been researching for several years, actually since the 1970s. Dr. Burl Payne is a PhD in psychology and a master's in physics. In the 1980s, he found that the start of the warring behavior occurred on the ascent or the descent of the sunspot cycle, and that the physical mechanism to trigger this was changes to the Earth's geomagnetic field, which affects brain rhythms and hormone balance of sensitive individuals. This is an illustration of that concept. This is a chart that he created showing where you can see here the conflicts, some of the conflicts beginning before the solar activity. You can see here examples of conflicts beginning after the peak in solar activity. So Burl Payne suggests that men have their own cycle. We know that women have a cycle that's connected to the moon. It's called PMS. And Burl suggests that men that are out of balance may have their own cycle called MMS, or male macho syndrome. And he believes that during this point in time, through an increase in solar activity, solar energy, that men receive an increase in testosterone in their physical bodies. He writes, quote, "Wars could be called a mass psychosis or a new disease, which is not caused by bacteria or a virus. If warring behavior is perceived as a previously unknown type of mass psychosis, then the means for dealing with it becomes different than those traditionally employed. And those means have not worked very well." It gets even deeper in his book, Planetary Influences. He observed that when Mars, Venus, and Mercury were near the Earth at the same time period, more sunspot numbers were likely to form, and more wars were more likely to start if the sunspot cycle was either on the ascending or descending part of the 11-year solar cycle. And he found that there's a correlation 85% of the time between periods when planets are relatively near the Earth and the production of sunspots and other solar activity. There's also a quote from a famous metaphysical teacher called George Gurdjieff, who said in the 1940s that war is the result of planetary influences. So we're now going to go over the evidence, the historical events that have taken place in different solar cycles, beginning in the late 18th century, around the time of the Revolutionary War. And we're going to have to abbreviate this for time. But what we can see in this particular chart, and there's many charts, it would take a half hour to get into all the things that took place between 1770 and 2013. But we saw events that led to the American Revolution in sunspot cycle number 2. In sunspot cycle 3, we see the American Revolution. We see the U.S. Constitution being written in the third solar cycle. Solar cycle 5, Napoleon conquers Europe, 1803 to 1806. And a lot of other things taking place in Europe. Solar cycles 8 through 10. And we see events that led to the Civil War, for example, in the United States, which ironically started 2 years after the 1859 Carnarvon event, where the grid went down. The grid that did exist at that point in time. We also saw revolts beginning in India, Italy, and China. Solar cycles 11 through 13. U.S. labor strikes, revolts in Sudan, First Indian Congress meets. 1893 to 95, Zulu Revolt, Cuban Revolution. And we see events that led to World War I, solar cycles 14 through 16. And as I said earlier, solar cycle 14 was double peaked, as they're projecting that this current solar cycle could be double peaked, 2013 and 2015. 1914 to 1919, First World War, Irish and Indian revolts, Russian Revolution, and the atom split. In 1929, by the way, during the peak in sunspots, the peak of the solar activity, we saw the Great Depression. We saw the stock market crash, rather, that led to the bottoming out of the Great Depression around 1933. During the same time period, we see Mussolini and Hitler rising to power, built on economic unrest and other revolts, formation of the Red Army, more mass civil disobedience in India. Now we're looking at events that led to World War II, solar cycles 17 to 19. Spanish Civil War, Germany and Japan start World War II. Japanese rape of Nanking, mass civil disobedience in India. U.S. still strike, 1947 to 1953. We see the Greek Civil War, Israeli-Arab War, India-Pakistan riots, Red Army wins China, Vietnam revolts, flying saucers start becoming more common throughout the United States. Following Project Paperclip,